Chapter 24. Looking for a doctor. Next morning, Jim searched around for sacking and straw to help to make Shrimps more comfortable. He managed to prop him up so he could eat more easily, but the boy only pecked at food. "Shrimps," said Jim, uneasy. "What's up with you?" "Old age, brother." In his heart, Jim was afraid it might be the cholera. Many people were dying of that, he knew. "What really happened, Shrimps?" "I got beat up, didn't I? This old gentleman give me a guinea. Honest he did. Probably thought it was a farthing, but he give me a guinea, fair and square. I think he took a fancy to my charming face." "I believe you." "And I was followed down this alley. Some bloke said I'd nicked it off the old gentleman. I had to give it back, and when I said I hadn't, they started kicking me and punching me like I was a rag doll. But I wasn't going to give my guinea up, was I? It was a present. Sooner give it my ma than them blokes. So I stuck it under my armpit. Anyway, they must have knocked me out good and proper. When I came to, my jacket had gone, and my guinea with it, and all my laces too. So the lads brought me here. Carried me, they did." "You should be in the hospital." Shrimps panicked then. "I don't want no hospital. I don't want no hospital." He was so scared that he tried to scramble out of the crate, knocking over the pot of water Jim had brought for him. "I won't take you there," Jim promised him. "Not if you don't want to go." Soon Shrimps drifted off to sleep. It frightened Jim, watching him. It reminded him of the way his mother had been. He was afraid to leave him, and he was afraid to stay with him. When Shrimps woke again, he coughed as if his body would break in half. He leaned back after the fit, exhausted. "I think I swallowed a fly, Jim," he said. "Must have slept with my mouth open." As he was drifting back to sleep again, Jim told him about Rosie's grandfather and about Grimy Nick and Snipe. He told him about the terrible night when he thought he'd murdered Grimy Nick, and about the circus, and about Grimy Nick's appearance in the big tent. "Ghosts is supposed to be white and thin, not coaly black with eyes like fires," chuckled Shrimps. When Shrimps slept again, Jim went off in search of food and help. One stallholder threw a cabbage at him, and he caught it before it hit him. "Thanks, mister," he shouted. He ran back to the crates with it, broke up some boxes for firewood, and that night he begged a light from the night watchman. He ran back to the crates with his flare blazing and cooked the cabbage in the water pot over the fire. He ate well that night, and even Shrimps managed to swallow some of the soupy liquid. "That was a feast, Jim," he said, belching softly and lying back. His face in the firelight was full of deep shadows. "I'll be better soon." But Shrimps didn't get better. He'd been starving for too long. Jim didn't know what to do to help him. He brought him fresh straw to lie on, but it was all he could do to roll him over and stuff it underneath him. Shrimps was afraid that their hiding place would be found by the police. He made Jim pile up more and more boxes round them. The nights were bitterly cold, and the sun was so weak that the daytime was hardly warmer. Winter was upon them. Jim had asked all the costermongers at the market for help. Some of the women came to peer at Shrimps in his crate, but they'd seen many a child in that state before, and they just shrugged. The street boys brought him things to eat, but he was too ill to touch it. "Needs a doctor, he does," one of the women said. "He can't go to the hospital, I promised him," Jim said. He was desperate for help. Didn't anybody care? He's scared of being taken to the workhouse. The woman nodded. "Nowhere else for him," she said, turning her back on the crate, rubbing her arms for warmth, "except a pauper's grave, and that'll be a blessing." She was already walking away as she said it. Jim tried begging for money. He waited outside the theatres where Shrimps used to sell his laces to the rich people. "Please," he'd say to the ladies and gentlemen stepping out of their carriages, "my brother's ever so ill. Please can I have some money for a doctor?" But they would turn away as if they hadn't really seen him. When he went back to Shrimps, he didn't even try to get him to eat. He just moistened his lips with water. Shrimp's eyes flickered open. "Lovely bit of beer, that is," he whispered, and fell asleep again. One night, Jim went to the theatre queue again, but this time he didn't ask for money. He skipped for them instead, and when they saw that he wasn't holding his cap out for coins and how lightly he danced, they started to take notice of him. Through the ragged holes in his trousers they could see the deep scar on his leg, but he danced as well as he had ever done. When quite a few people were gathered round him, he stopped and clapped his hands. "Can anyone give me the name of a doctor, please?" he shouted. "One that won't charge money." Nobody answered him. The theatre doors opened and they swarmed in, forgetting him. The woman with the coffee cart called him over. She gave Jim a mug of coffee to warm him up. "Seen you skipping," she said. "How's that friend of yours? He's still bad?" Jim nodded. He wished he could carry the mug of coffee to Shrimps, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. Jim gulped down the coffee. "I'm looking for a doctor for him. Don't know one, do you? One that won't charge. I could do jobs for him." She frowned. "There is a doctor of some sort not far from here, but I've never heard of him doing any doctoring like. Barney something they call him. The little kids next door to me go to his school." "School? I don't want anything to do with school." Jim remembered the schoolroom at the workhouse, a lofty room, and the boys quiet and afraid at their desks, the pacing schoolmaster. "The Ragged School. Ain't you heard of it?" the woman went on. She stopped to serve someone with pickled eggs and coffee. "All I know is it's somewhere kids go when they don't have money to pay for school. They do a lot of praying." Again, Jim remembered the schoolroom with the painted arches. God is good, God is holy, God is just, God is love. He could hear again the thin chanting of the boys' voices as they recited it every day. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I wouldn't go there, missus, never." "Suit yourself," she said. "He's the only doctor I know of." But during that night, Shrimps grew worse. He was hot and feverish, and weak though he was, he coughed all the time. Jim put his hand under his friend's head to prop him up. He pulled away the straw to push some fresh under, and saw that it was spotted with blood. 25. The Ragged School. Next morning, early, he waited for the coffee woman to bring her cart. When he saw her dragging it up through the mud, he ran to meet her. "He's worse," he panted. "Can you come to him?" "I can't leave my stall," she told him. "If I don't give breakfast to the early workers, I've lost my best trade. If you tell me where that school is, I'll go there." "It's round about over there somewhere round Ernest Street." The woman waved her arm vaguely. She was sorry enough for the boy, but there were plenty more where he came from, skinny, helpless sparrows. The streets were full of them. If she helped one, they'd all be round for help, and she had her own children to feed. If she didn't earn enough to keep her rent paid, they'd all be out in the streets, all in the same state as Jim. It didn't bear thinking about. She had to keep going. Jim ran off. Some of the street boys shouted after him, "How's Shrimps?" But Jim didn't even bother to tell them. No child could help Shrimps now. "Know where the Ragged School is?" he asked one of them, a crippled boy called Davy, who was older than most of them. Davy shook his head. "I've heard of it," he said. "There's a man with a donkey used to come round wanting boys to go to his school. We used to chuck tomatoes at him." "School?" he spat out the corner of his mouth. "Don't trust them places, I don't." Jim managed to coax some milk from a dairy woman, and he ran back to Shrimps with it, moistening the boy's lips. His hair was dark with sweat, but he was cold. "Please let them take you to the hospital, Shrimps," he said. But Shrimps shook his head. "I'm all right here. Proper little palace, this crate." Davy and some of the younger boys came to see Shrimps, and Jim left him to them and went off again. At last, when it was nearly dark, he came across a group of children. Brothers and sisters they must have been, they were so alike. They were coming up a back alleyway together, and some of them were clutching slates. They were dressed in rags, but they obviously had a home to go to. "Have you been to the Ragged School?" Jim asked. One of them nodded. "Is there a doctor there?" The children looked at each other. "That Barney bloke said he was a doctor, didn't he?" "That's right, only he don't give us medicine, he gives us hymns." One of the children started singing and the others giggled. "Where is it?" The older child ran back with Jim and pointed out a long shed-like building. "There it is," he said, "and there's that Barney bloke now, just coming out." Jim raced down the street. The man locked the door of the shed and began to move quickly in the other direction. "Dr. Barney!" Jim shouted out, but his voice was drowned out by the rumble of carriage wheels. He pressed himself against the wall to let the carriage pass. The doctor raised his hand as the carriage approached and the driver reined in his horse. Jim started running again. "Doctor!" he shouted, but the man hadn't heard him. He climbed up into the carriage and was away before Jim reached it. Mud spattered up into Jim's face. When he got back to the crates behind the market, the other boys had gone. Someone had placed a small candle in a bowl, and its soft light was some kind of comfort in the dark. Jim crawled in beside Shrimps. "It's going to be all right now," he whispered. "I've found a doctor, and he's coming to see you tomorrow." But even as he spoke, the words were like stones in his throat. He reached out and felt for the boy's hand. It was cold.